Paul Hogan, the unlikely journey from nobody to global superstar. Sometimes the greatest legends begin with the smallest dreams. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys start with ordinary people who simply refuse to accept that ordinary is all they'll ever be. This is the story of Paul Hogan, a man who transformed himself from an anonymous bridge worker into one of the most recognizable faces on earth, proving that with enough determination, authenticity, and a willingness to take impossible risks, anyone can rewrite their destiny. But this isn't just a story about fame and fortune. This is a story about courage. The courage to leave security behind and chase the unknown. The courage to bet everything on yourself when nobody else believes, and the courage to stay true to who you are even when the world is trying to change you. Paul Hogan's journey is the ultimate proof that in the game of life, it's not where you start that matters, it's how far you're willing to go. Chapter 1: The Dreamer from Nowhere. October 8, 1939. A small house in Parramatta, Western Sydney. While the world was descending into chaos, Florence and John Hogan welcomed their son Paul into a reality that offered few promises and even fewer opportunities. In working-class Australia, dreams were luxuries that most families couldn't afford. You were born into your place in the world, and you stayed there. The Hogan household was built on foundations of hard work and modest expectations. John Hogan, a disciplined army man who became a purchasing officer for the army canteen, understood the value of steady employment. Florence worried about appearances and respectability above all else. Together, they created a home that prioritized stability over ambition, conformity over creativity. We were sort of a regular family for that era. Paul would later reflect, though, there was nothing regular about the restless energy that burned inside this particular child. Even as a young boy, Paul possessed a magnetic quality that drew people to him. His quick wit and natural charisma made him popular, but it also marked him as someone who didn't fit the expected mold. Growing up in Granville, Cabramatta, and surrounding western suburbs meant understanding the unspoken rules of Australian class society. These weren't neighborhoods where people dreamed of stardom. They were places where working-class families raised working-class children who would work in factories, drive trucks, or find secure government jobs. But Paul was different from the start. He possessed an almost supernatural confidence that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Where other children might have been intimidated by authority or overwhelmed by new situations, Paul thrived on attention and seemed genuinely surprised when people didn't immediately find him as fascinating as he found himself. I was never the class clown, but yes, I was a bit of a know-all and a bit of a troublemaker, Paul remembered. This wasn't juvenile delinquency, but the restlessness of someone intellectually and creatively hungry in an environment that didn't offer much mental stimulation. When schools introduced IQ testing, Paul scored remarkably high, revealing intelligence his casual demeanor had concealed. The worst thing that happened was they brought in IQ tests. Paul would later joke, "I had to do it, so I did it. Turned out I had this really high IQ, so I was constantly under pressure to live up to it. But I was just good at doing IQ tests. I'm not really clever." This experience taught Paul one of life's most important lessons. The gap between perception and reality could be manipulated to his advantage. Being underestimated was actually a form of power, allowing him to exceed expectations in ways that impressed people far more than simple competence ever could. School held no appeal for the restless teenager. When he left at 15, his first job was as an apprentice molder at a foundry, work so physically demanding and dangerous that Paul described it as like working in hell. Standing in that furnace-hot factory watching grown men destroy their bodies for minimal wages, Paul experienced an epiphany that would shape everything that followed. The decision to walk away from his apprenticeship was the first major risk of Paul's life, setting a pattern that would define his entire career. He swept streets, cleaned sewers, did whatever work he could find, but never stopped looking for something better. During this challenging period, Paul discovered boxing, which taught him discipline while providing a constructive outlet for the explosive temper that had been getting him into trouble. "I had a bad temper," he admitted. I don't know why. It's just things that set me off violently. Boxing became therapy. That's when I got into boxing, and that took it away," Paul explained. "It's sort of self-discipline, stopped being bad-tempered. It was the best thing that could have happened." But boxing gave Paul more than fitness and emotional regulation. In the gym, surrounded by tough men who respected strength and authenticity, Paul discovered that his quick wit and natural charisma could be powerful assets. Chapter 2: Finding His Voice. Paul's early 20s were a period of drift and discovery that tested his resolve and shaped his character. The boxing gym became his first real stage, where he learned to work a crowd, tell stories, and make people laugh even in serious environments. His fellow boxers began looking forward to Paul's commentary on fights, current events and life in general. It was at the local swimming pool where Paul first discovered his true calling, though he didn't recognize it at the time. Working as a pool attendant and part-time lifeguard, Paul found himself naturally performing for crowds during Sydney's hot summer. He wasn't consciously trying to entertain, he was simply being himself, but doing it with such confidence and charm that it became its own form of performance art. "I was a massive flirt," Paul remembered about those days. "I thought that was my first important job anyway." But the pool was more than just a workplace. It was where Paul met Noeline Edwards, who would become his first wife and mother of his children. Their courtship was typical of working-class Australia in the early 1960s, uncomplicated, passionate, and leading quickly to marriage and family. Paul became a father at 19 and had 3 sons by 22, circumstances that forced him to mature rapidly while giving him a sense of purpose he had previously lacked. "I actually had 3 sons by the time I was 22, so I had to grow up very fast," Paul recalled. "But I sort of dug it. I loved it and we grew up together, me and my kids." The young family lived in a tiny 2-bedroom house in Cabramatta. Money always tight, but Paul approached fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else. Recognizing he needed steady, well-paying work to support his growing family, Paul made a decision that would define the next chapter. He would become a rigger on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. This wasn't work for the weak or uncommitted. Working on the bridge required physical courage, technical skill, and the ability to function as part of a team where one person's mistake could cost another's life. "I ended up settling down on the Harbour Bridge," Paul explained. "It was work like getting up at 4 to 6 in the morning, get on a bus, on a train, and go to work. The work was demanding and dangerous, but it gave Paul something he'd never experienced: genuine pride in his labor." Being a rigger on Sydney Harbour Bridge wasn't just any job. It was skilled, respected work requiring both physical bravery and technical expertise. Paul's natural leadership abilities and infectious personality made him popular among fellow riggers. He became known as someone who could lighten the mood during difficult work, who could crack a joke that would relieve tension without undermining safety. His workmates began relying on him not just for technical skills, but for maintaining morale during long, challenging days. Financially, it was always a struggle, but didn't know any other life, so didn't have any problems with it. Paul remembered, the routine was demanding but satisfying. Up before dawn on the bridge by sunrise, home in the evening to play with his children. Noeline would sometimes bring the boys to the bridge for lunch, pointing up at their father working high above the harbor. But even as Paul seemed to settle into working-class family life, something inside remained restless and hungry. He began noticing that his ability to entertain workmates was more than ordinary workplace banter. It was genuine talent for making people laugh, think, and feel. Fellow riggers would gather around Paul during breaks, hanging on his words as he dissected current events, politicians, and social trends with insight and humor none of them had encountered before. Paul began wondering if there might be something more for him beyond the bridge, beyond the narrow confines of working-class expectations. But it would take an act of incredible courage and almost reckless faith to transform that wondering into action. Chapter 3: The Leap of Faith. In 1971, Paul Hogan made a decision that would seem completely out of character for a sensible family man with 3 young children and a mortgage. He decided to audition for a television talent show called New Face It. This wasn't a casual whim or spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a calculated risk based on Paul's growing belief that he possessed something special that deserved a larger audience. What made Paul's decision so remarkable wasn't just that he had no professional entertainment experience, it was that he didn't even have a traditional act. He couldn't sing, dance, or perform magic tricks. He simply walked into the audition with nothing but his natural personality and unshakable confidence that he could figure it out as he went along. When Paul was applying to go on New Faces, he thought, where can I say I'm from? Lightning Ridge. Paul later joked about his decision to claim he was from a tiny outback town rather than suburban Sydney. This white lie was Paul's first masterpiece of image creation. Lightning Ridge sounded more authentically Australian, more colorful than the mundane truth about growing up in Western Sydney. Paul's appearance on New Faces was unlike anything Australian television had seen. He didn't try to impress judges with technical skill or professional polish. Instead, he simply talked, sharing observations about life, politics, and Australian culture with wit, wisdom, and working-class authenticity that was completely fresh. The judges and audience were captivated by this unpretentious man who seemed completely comfortable in his own skin, who never tried to be anything other than exactly what he was. Paul won not because he was the most talented in any traditional sense, but because he was the most authentic. And in a world increasingly dominated by artifice, authenticity had become the rarest and most valuable commodity. Australian audience, television audience, knew I didn't care. Paul explained about what made his performance compelling. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, or transform himself into something he wasn't. He was simply being Paul Hogan, but doing it with such confidence and natural charm that it became its own form of entertainment. Among those watching was John Cornell, a brilliant young television producer who had been searching for exactly what Paul represented, an authentic Australian voice that could speak to ordinary people without talking down to them. Cornell had worked as a journalist and understood the power of connecting with audiences on their own level. When Cornell saw Paul's performance, he experienced the kind of creative epiphany that happens maybe once in a career. Here was someone who could represent the Australian everyman, not as a caricature but as a real person with genuine insights and natural charisma. Cornell knew immediately he was looking at something special, perhaps even revolutionary. The partnership between Paul Hogan and John Cornell would become one of the most successful collaborations in Australian entertainment history. Cornell brought vision, business acumen, and industry connections that Paul lacked. Paul brought charisma, timing, and instinctive understanding of what audiences wanted to hear. Together they would revolutionize Australian television and eventually conquer international entertainment market. Cornell approached Paul with an offer that seemed almost too good to be true. How would he like to appear regularly on A Current Affair, a new television program revolutionizing Australian news program? Paul would be paid substantially more than his bridge work earned to simply share his opinions about current events. For a man who had spent his entire adult life being told to know his place and stay in it, the offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Paul had never been on television beyond his single New Faces appearance. He had no media training, no understanding of how television worked, and no idea whether his bridge worker persona would translate to ongoing success. But Paul Hogan had never been one to back down from a challenge. He accepted Cornell's offer, though he insisted on one crucial condition: he would maintain his day job on the bridge. Television was too unpredictable to stake his family's financial security on. He would work the bridge during the week, and film his television segments on Friday afternoon. This decision to keep one foot in his old life while stepping into his new one would prove to be pure genius. It gave Paul the security to be fearless on television, knowing that if everything went wrong, he could always return to honest work. More importantly, it kept him grounded in the real world that his television persona represented. Chapter 4: Becoming the Voice of Australia. Paul's debut on A Current Affair was unlike anything Australian television had ever broadcast. Here was a man who looked like he'd just finished a construction shift. Work boots, casual clothes, and an accent that was pure Australian working class, offering opinions about politics and social issues with insight and irreverence that was both refreshing and revolutionary. The television landscape of early 1970s Australia was dominated by people who spoke with refined accents, wore expensive suits, and approached current affairs with serious-minded pomposity that made ordinary viewers feel excluded from important conversation. Paul changed all of that simply by being himself. They were looking for someone to give the man in the street's opinion, and I was a genuine man in the street. Paul explained about his role. I would just come in after work on the bridge and very casually get in front of the camera and do his piece. What made Paul's segments compelling wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. He never used scripts, preferring to speak directly from experience and observation. His comments were spontaneous, authentic, and often hilariously on target in ways that scripted television rarely achieved. It was never scripted, Paul remembered. It was what I thought I'd say, and then whatever came out in front of the camera, that's what went to air. This approach was revolutionary in an industry that typically scripted every word. Paul's willingness to speak without a net created television that felt alive and immediate. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured in from viewers who felt that finally someone on television was speaking their language, sharing their concerns, and doing it with humor and intelligence rather than condescension. Paul Hogan wasn't talking down to ordinary Australians. He was one of. They got a tremendous reaction from audiences, Paul recalled. Straight away, people could see that this guy really had something. But success created its own challenges. Paul was now living a double life that was sometimes absurd in its contradiction. He would appear on national television Friday night, then report for bridge work Monday morning alongside men who had watched him. That was a bit of embarrassment. Paul admitted, I was still sort of climbing up and down the cords and over the top of the arch and lumping gear all day, and people driving under in their car, so there he is. The situation became almost farcical. Paul would be on national television one night, offering opinions on major issues. Then the next day he'd be on the train with people who had watched him offering their own commentary. I'd be on national television one night expanding my views, taking their ratings up, and the next day I'd be on the train with the audience giving me advice. Paul laughed. Poor and famous sucks. John Cornell finally convinced Paul he couldn't continue straddling both worlds. The television work was too promising, too lucrative, and too demanding to remain a side project. Cornell could see that Paul had potential to become much more than just a regular contributor. He could become a major star in his own right. John Cornell is a really clever man, and he guided Paul's career, Paul acknowledged. There was no end to John's vision, and we just sort of hit it off straight away. We were the same type of person, and he said, you shouldn't be doing this. You should have your own Cornell's vision extended far beyond television success within Australia. He could see that Paul's appeal wasn't limited to Australian audiences. There was something universal about his charm, humor, and everyman persona that could translate to international success. But first, they needed to establish Paul as more than just a television personality. They needed to make him a brand, a cultural phenomenon, and eventually, a global icon. Chapter 5. Building the Empire. The transformation of Paul Hogan from television personality to cultural phenomenon required careful strategic planning. Cornell understood that Paul's success lay in maintaining the balance between authenticity and commercial appeal, while gradually expanding his reach. The Winfield cigarette advertising campaign was their breakthrough. Cornell positioned these commercials as a way to showcase Paul's personality in high-production settings that would establish him as more than just a television commentator. The ads brilliantly placed Paul's working-class persona in sophisticated international settings where his irreverence could puncture pretension while remaining likable. It was really John Cornell that decided that Paul had to be presented under the best circumstances. Paul explained, that started with the Winfield ads. John saw the great juxtaposition between the working-class man and some very classy projects. Paul would appear in exotic locations, fancy restaurants, exclusive clubs, always slightly out of place but never intimidated. Anyhow, have a Winfield became a national catchphrase, establishing Paul as someone who could represent Australia internationally. The Paul Hogan Show established Paul as Australia's premier entertainer. The variety show format showcased different aspects of his personality while introducing characters like Strop that became cultural mythology. They were celebrating working-class culture without apologizing, giving Australians permission to be proud of who they were. Chapter 6. The Hollywood Dream. By the early 1980s, Paul had conquered Australian television, but Cornell had bigger dreams. The answer came in Dundee, the crocodile hunter character Paul had been developing.
Mick Dundee was Paul amplified, more adventurous, skilled and exotic, but retaining essential qualities that made Paul irresistible. The concept for Crocodile Dundee was simple: take an authentic Australian character and place him in New York City. The culture clash would generate comedy while allowing audiences to see both cultures through fresh eyes. Mick would be simultaneously sophisticated and innocent, understanding fundamental truths his urban counterparts had forgotten. Getting the film made proved nearly impossible. Hollywood studios couldn't understand the appeal. Australian financiers were skeptical. Paul and Cornell decided to finance it themselves, betting their careers on their belief that audiences would embrace Mick Dundee. The production was low budget, shot guerrilla style, often without permit. Paul threw himself into the role completely, learning survival skills and studying crocodile behavior. Linda Kozlowski's casting as Sue Charlton was crucial. The chemistry was immediate and genuine, adding unexpected romantic dimension. Chapter 7: Conquering the World. When Crocodile Dundee premiered in Australia in April 1986, it broke every box office record in cinema history. But the real test came internationally. When it opened in the United States in September 1986, American audiences embraced Mick Dundee enthusiastically. The film grossed over $170 million domestically, establishing Paul Hogan as an international star. "That's a night" became a transcendent catchphrase. But it wasn't just memorable lines. It was Paul's performance, which managed to be both larger than life and completely believable. The success transformed Paul from Australian television personality to global superstar overnight. "I've sat in a theater in London with Prince Charles on one side and Princess Diana on the other," Paul reflected, "and they're both enjoying it. What I don't know, I'm just a rigger." This quote captures something essential. Even at success's peak, Paul never forgot who he was or where he came from. The humility that had made him lovable as a bridge worker remained intact when he was one of the world's most famous people. Paul's influence opened doors for generations of Australian performers, proved Australian stories could succeed globally, and created a template for authentic cultural representation that continues influencing how Australians present themselves to the world. Chapter 8: Lessons in Resilience. The period following massive global success brought challenges that tested Paul's character. Personal relationships strained under constant attention, professional demands created impossible expectations, and the success he had worked so hard to achieve began feeling like a burden rather than a blessing. The most difficult aspect was learning to balance his authentic self with the demands of being a global icon. Every public appearance was scrutinized for signs that Paul was either losing touch with his roots or failing to live up to his potential. The pressure to be consistently charming and authentically Australian was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. But Paul's working-class background had taught him something invaluable: how to survive difficult times without losing his essential character. The same resilience that had carried him through foundry work, financial struggles, and years of rejection now served him well in dealing with the pressures of fame. "Before I got into television and entertainment, it was a huge advantage because it gave me a perspective," Paul observed. "God Almighty, I was scraping to pay the rent when I was 30. This perspective, understanding that success is temporary and character matters more than reputation, became the foundation for Paul's approach to later career stages." Epilogue: The legacy of an extraordinary journey. Today, Paul Hogan's story stands as one of the most remarkable examples of personal transformation in modern entertainment history. From anonymous bridge worker to global icon who helped define how Australia is perceived worldwide, his journey embodies the truth that extraordinary achievements are possible for anyone willing to take extraordinary risks. His life is all about a fundamentally sound, grounded human being who had the courage to live the dream, summarized one longtime friend. This courage, willingness to risk security for opportunity, to bet everything on uncertain outcomes, to persist through failure and criticism, is what made Paul's journey possible and continues making it inspiring. Paul's impact extends far beyond individual achievement. He opened doors for generations of Australian performers, proved Australian content could succeed globally, and created a template for authentic cultural representation. His success helped Australia develop confidence in its cultural identity, and demonstrated that authenticity and humor could be more powerful than sophistication and pretension. Perhaps most importantly, Paul Hogan's story proves it's never too late to reinvent yourself. take risks pursuing your dreams, or discover capabilities you never knew you possessed. His journey required not just talent and determination, but willingness to believe in himself when nobody else did, and persist through challenges that would have defeated most people. I hope you enjoyed the little journey with me, Paul said recently, words that capture the spirit defining his entire approach to entertainment and life. Paul has always understood that success is fundamentally about taking people on a journey, whether it's a television segment, feature film, or lifetime of creative work. The bridge worker who became a legend has completed a circle, bringing him back to values and authenticity that made his journey possible. Paul Hogan's story is ultimately about the power of being yourself, staying connected to your roots, and the extraordinary things that become possible when you have courage to pursue dreams, regardless of obstacle. From Sydney Harbour Bridge steel girders to Hollywood's bright lights and beyond, Paul proved that with enough courage, authenticity, and determination, an ordinary person can achieve extraordinary things. More importantly, he showed that success means nothing if you lose yourself achieving it, and that the greatest victories are often found not in conquering the world, but in remaining true to who you are no matter how dramatically circumstances change. Paul Hogan's greatest performance was learning to be authentically himself in every situation, from humblest beginnings to heights of international fame. That performance continues today, remaining as compelling and inspiring as ever for anyone who has ever dared to dream of something better than the life they were born into. The unlikely journey from nobody to global superstar is complete, but the man who made that journey continues proving every day that the best stories are not about reaching a destination, but about having the courage to begin the journey in the first place.